verse 28. What we're going to do, I'm going to preach, and then we're going to end by taking communion and praying for one another. Is that okay? So that's kind of how we're going to land this evening, hopefully. This evening? We've somehow time traveled. I apologize, you've just missed lunch. Okay, so John chapter 18, verse 28. But just to let you know, if you've not kind of followed along or you're just visiting or whatever, where are we up to? What's happened? Well, Jesus and his disciples have just begun to celebrate the Passover festival, which God told the Jews it had to last for 7 days of partying, celebrating, remembering what God did in the Exodus through Moses. And during that time, Jesus has been communicating his kind of last orders to his disciples, his followers, minus Judas. So Judas has left to betray Jesus. Jesus then prays, and they head out to the Garden of Gethsemane. And then Judas arrives with Roman and Jewish soldiers and guards to arrest his betrayed Jesus. At that, just before, while that's all going on, Peter takes out a small sword and slices the ear off of one of the soldiers. And Jesus says, hey, no, that's not what we do. In my kingdom, that's not what we do. And Luke even tells the story that Jesus heals the ear of the guy. A kind of amazing creative miracle, makes an ear reappear. And so Jesus is taken unjustly and illegally, in terms of Jewish law, to the Jewish high court and before the high priest, Annas and Caiaphas. And during that time, Peter is confronted. He kind of follows a little bit further on. And Peter is confronted 3 times, and 3 times he denies his master. And so with the kind of sound of the cockerel ringing in our ears, we get to the next part of the story. So are you ready to dive in? We're going to finish chapter 18 together. Hopefully it should come up on the screen as well if you don't have it. Okay. So they then led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. And what that means is because they celebrated the Passover for a whole week, they probably would have already eaten the Passover meal the night before, but they wanted to be clean for the whole festival. So just so you kind of understand that. So Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Pilate then said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." That was what the Romans had decided, that was what the Jews couldn't do. This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this by your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting," that's present tense, so they would be fighting right now, "that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from this world." Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. You're right. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is on the side of truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" After he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I should release to you one man at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" They cried out again, "No, not that man, but we want Barabbas." Now, just to help you understand, it is very likely that Barabbas' first name was Jesus. And the name Barabbas means son of the Father. Okay, very important. We'll come back to that in a moment. Now, Barabbas, this is how it finishes. Now, Barabbas was a robber or insurrectionist. Now, I want to look at three things. I want to look at what does Jesus say, what Jesus does, what Jesus is. What Jesus says, what Jesus does, what Jesus is. But let me just start with another question. Do you know him? Do you know Jesus? Because that's why we're all here. Do you know him? Today, you can know him. You can know the King of Kings. You can know the one who is present here with his people, who will one day wrap up all things and make all things new. Do you know him? Have you ever taken the time or the energy or the thought? Have you ever been willing to ask the question, who is Jesus? Maybe you're sat here today and you don't know him. I want to invite you, as we look into this passage, I want you to ask the question, do I want to know this man? Do I want to know this God? Because you can know him like I know him. You can know him like so many other people in this room, like we've been celebrating and worshiping and encountering. You can know him today if you don't already. So let's look at, what does Jesus say? Now, the overall theme of the passage is about the kingdom of Jesus. So that's why Pilate asked the question, are you, it's said with a bit of contempt, this guy, this carpenter from Nazareth, this guy who the Jews have been kind of beating, so he's probably bruised and broken and bloodied, this guy, you're a king? I love how Jesus answers that question. Let's look at what he says. First, Jesus, in order to help him understand the nature of his kingdom, he first answers it negatively to kind of this cross-examination. He explains what his kingdom isn't like. So verse 36, my kingdom's not of this world. It's not like the other kingdoms. If my kingdom was like the other kingdoms, then my followers would be fighting right now. But my kingdom is not from here. It's not like, he is speaking to the representative of the most powerful empire in the world, and he's saying, my kingdom isn't at all like the Roman Empire. It's not like how the Jews rule. It's not like the Chinese and their empire. It's not from here. It's from heaven. So he answers it negatively. It's not like that. Yeah, I'm a king, but my dominion is not like any other kingdom. You cannot, Pilate, you cannot understand my kingdom by comparing it to yours. While I am a man standing before you, there is nothing human about the rule that I bring. But then he says it positively, verse 37. For this purpose, to reign, to be a king, I was born. And for this purpose, I have come into the world. Now, friends, we could explore that one phrase for a very long time. And I would encourage you to go home and chew that over. But I have come, why? To bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. Jesus' kingdom is a kingdom of truth. Or you could translate that word reality. I have come to bring ultimate reality. But the thing I want you to notice is this. The nature of the kingdom determines the action of its followers. And that's actually what Jesus says in our passage, isn't it? If my kingdom was of this world, then actually my followers would be fighting. So let me try and illustrate for you. This might be a familiar image. I think one of the best TV moments of all time. Only Fools and Horses, Del Boy and Rodney. Okay, they are part of a TV program called Only Fools and Horses. And this scene actually made it into the closing ceremony of the 2012 Olympic Games. Okay, it's kind of that burned into British memory. If you haven't seen this moment, let me explain it to you. Del Boy and Rodney have been invited to a friend Harry's fancy dress party, so they dress up as Batman and Robin. Frustratingly, on the way to the party, their car breaks down, but they're only about 5 minutes from the party. So reluctantly, they run through the back streets of where they live to the fancy dress party. And even during that time, they prevent a mugging because people see them in the distance and are like, oh no, it's Batman and Robin. And they run off. And then they get to Harry's home and they burst through the doors and they spray silly string everywhere, only to realize they're surrounded by people wearing black. Harry had died the day before, and they had burst in their fancy dress to awake. Their actions doesn't fit the nature of the event, the nature of the moment. And that's what Jesus is getting at here. Jesus is saying to Pilate, I have not come to recruit soldiers, I've come to recruit sheep. And so the nature of Jesus' kingdom, a kingdom of truth, determines the action of his followers. So for the Romans, the nature of their kingdom was we're going to rule by brute force and power, and so therefore they had a huge army. Jesus is saying, I've not come to recruit soldiers, I've come to recruit sheep who listen to my voice. Jesus isn't planning an insurrection against the Romans like Barabbas had, and like the many Jews thought that the Messiah would do. No, his people are not fighting. That's why he rebukes Peter for slicing the guy's ear. No, that's not what my kingdom is about. I have come to bring a different type of rebellion. So he says, everyone who is of the truth, everyone who belongs to or loves or is on the side of truth, what do? They don't fight, they listen. The nature of his kingdom determines the action of its followers. And so Jesus, the King of all kings, stands before Pilate. Why? Because he has come to undo the kingdom of lies. The enslavement of lies that started way back in the garden with Adam and Eve. Satan, who earlier in John's gospel, Jesus calls the father of lies, who whispers false promises. The primary weapon of the kingdom on the earth of Satan is lies. So Jesus, the King of heaven, has come to bring the full truth and reality on the nature of God's kingdom. You see, Jesus' reign happens between your ears. The primary activity of discipleship, which is what we're all about, disciples who make disciples, the primary activity of discipleship is listening. Why? Because that's the kingdom that we belong to. So Jesus will say in chapter 10, I am the good shepherd, which is Jewish for I'm the leader of God's people. I know my own and my own know me, and I lay down my life for my sheep. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. See, listening, not fighting. Following, not forcing. Responding, not overthrowing are the chief activities of his citizens. So let me ask you a question. Whose voice carries the most weight in your life? Who has your ears? For whoever has your ears has your heart. In fact, the word ear is right in the middle of the word heart. John Mark Comer says this: what you give your attention to is the person you become. The mind is the portal to the soul, and what you fill your mind with will shape the trajectory of your character. In the end, your life is no more than the sum of what you give your attention to. Everyone who is on the side of truth listens to my voice. Let me just try and make this a bit more personal. Whose voice do you listen to the most? Well, I'd like to suggest that there is nobody that talks to you more than you do. Because from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep, is there not an internal dialogue going on between yourself? All the time. I'm actually doing it now while I'm preaching. Jesus' discipleship, his call to follow him, is a call to put yourself on mute and let his voice of truth direct and define you. And let me say this, that is countercultural, dear friends. If you want to know what it looks like to live in the kingdom of God in our day, it means you put yourself on mute and you listen to him. Because our culture tells us you need to listen to yourself. No, you don't, dear friends. The way you find real freedom is you listen to the shepherd. We're sheep, not soldiers. Okay, let's move on. That's what Jesus says. Let's look at what Jesus does. I don't know about you, I love a heist movie. Do you love a heist movie? Team gets together, they've got to kind of acquire something. So Ocean's 11, Now You See Me, Mission Impossible, all those kind of things. And the best part is always the twist, isn't it? The best part in a heist movie is that moment where it looks like the team is beaten or captured or their plan is unraveled, and then suddenly the moment happens, your eyes are opened and you realize they planned for this all along. They've already managed to hoodwink their enemies. They've accounted for every scenario. They are one step ahead of the plan all the time. And actually, don't you notice that in our story? For actually, in our story, we have to ask the question, who is really in control here? Who actually has the power? So notice, the Jewish leaders, they're scrambling around. They're approaching Pilate and saying, we need you to kill this guy. They don't have the power or the authority to do it. We need you to do this for us. And even more so, what's even more kind of alarming is internally they're a mess. Internally they're a mess because they are wanting to kill the innocent Son of God, the most heinous crime that's ever been committed by humanity, but they won't enter the governor's house because it might make them unclean. The hypocrisy. They are a mess, aren't they? They're not in control. Now notice Pilate. Pilate in our story, he is also not in control. History would tell us that Pilate's rule over Israel had not been going well. And here, in our moment, he is faced with an innocent man and an angry mob outside. And he's trying to deal with the two. He's trying to keep the Jews happy, but also, and so he ends up throwing out a WhatsApp poll. Would you rather, shall I release to you Jesus or shall I release to you Barabbas? He doesn't have the ability to decide and rule. And yet, right in the middle of our story, Jesus seems completely in control. Completely in control. Here, in the face of the greatest political and military force on the planet, Jesus seems utterly in control. So there's a few layers. If you're not convinced, let me convince you. Okay, there's a few layers to this. First of all, layer one, Jesus interrogates his judge. So, Pilate, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus is like, is that what you believe? Are those your words, or are you just repeating what other people have told you? Just so I know how to answer you, Pilate, could you please make it clear? Is that what you believe? Or, and so Don Carson, he writes this: Jesus has become the interrogator. The prisoner has become the judge. And Bruce Milne even takes it a little bit further. He says, Jesus is not in the least degree intimidated by the personal representative of the Roman emperor. And he even attempts to personalize the conversation, reaching out to Pilate as a man needing to find the grace of God. Jesus seems in control, even during his arrest and cross-examination. Nothing scares him. There's another layer to it as well. Notice in the passage that John says this was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. Now, normally, if you're a prisoner, you don't get to choose your mode of execution. Okay? Jesus' plan is coming together, and the guys working are working to accomplish it. You see, if the Jews had the authority to kill Jesus, they would have stoned him. That's what the Jews would have done, but Jesus hadn't chosen stoning, he had chosen the cross. He had chosen how he was gonna die. And he even quoted that back in chapter 12. You see, you need to understand, by all the things that are happening in this moment, they are fulfilling the purpose of Jesus. So I love this. Just 10 verses later, you'll get to this next week. Jesus even says this to Pilate. Just try and imagine this, okay? So Pilate says to him, "Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus' answer to that is this: "You have no authority over me unless it is being given to you from heaven." It seems like Jesus had been swept into the current of the Jewish jealousy and the Roman kind of power. Only actually what is happening is God is outworking his plan. So I love what S.M. Lockridge in his famous sermon, "That's My King," he says this: the Pharisees couldn't stand him, but they found out they couldn't stop him. There's another layer Jesus even adds to this as well. I don't know about you, but did you have any control over when you were born? I didn't go on to Tesco's and book a delivery slot. Yeah? I want to be born at this time in this moment. But actually, that's exactly what Jesus says to Pilate. Isn't it? He says, "For this purpose I was born. And for this purpose I have come into the world." Jesus, as John unpacks in the first chapter, Jesus is the pre-existent one. And he is saying to Pilate, "Pilate, I am here because this is what I was born for." The only person in all of history who chose when he would be born had chosen to be born so that he could die for you. The only one who had that level of control, the crowning achievement of his life, was that he might die on a cross for you and for me. Jesus was born for this. So you are not as in control of your life as you think you are. But Jesus is. Jesus is. So imagine, put yourself in the shoes of John's first readers. It's in the first century. The pressure and the power of the Roman government and rule is persecuting and pressuring Christians all over the empire. Imagine reading this story and Jesus in the midst of the pressure and the power of the Roman Empire. He's in complete peace and control. Imagine the comfort, imagine the courage that would give you. Imagine the courage to choose sacrifice in that moment. But there's another layer. And the layer is this, is that Jesus fulfills the Passover. Jesus fulfills the Passover. You see, what we are reading has actually all happened before. It's happened before. Some 1,300 years before our moment, there was another prophet who came bringing the truth and reality of who God was. And that prophet found himself in the court of the most powerful empire on the planet, Egypt. Moses stepped into the court of Egypt saying, you need to let God's people go. God's going to set people free. He's going to judge you, and he's going to bring the powers behind you to nothing. And you want to know what, Pharaoh? God is going to set his son free. His firstborn son, Israel, he's going to bring him into freedom to worship and serve him. But do you want to know how God brought about such freedom and liberation in that moment? Yes, you do. Excellent. He would do it by saying, you need to take a perfect lamb and sacrifice it. A faultless, perfect, glorious lamb without blemish, and you need to sacrifice it and put the blood over your door. And what I want you to do is eat that lamb, and I want you to take bread. And so he's saying, you need bread and you need blood. That's how you will make my freedom count in your life. And then in that moment, the righteous judgment of God came upon Egypt, and the firstborn was killed. But all those that had the blood of the lamb were free. And so the gods of Egypt were powerless against the mighty arm of God's deliverance. So the firstborn son of God, Israel, walked free, all because of the blood of the lamb. So let's jump forward to our story. Jesus, the ultimate prophet, who bears witness to the fullness of the truth of God, he is in the courts of the most oppressive, powerful empire of his day. And he has been arrested, and because he is opposing the powers that be. But the firstborn son is there to bring about a greater freedom, an everlasting liberation from the powers of sin and death and darkness. He's come to release the guilty from prison. He's come to set us free to worship and serve his Father. But do you want to know, he's not just the prophet, he's also the Lamb. He's the perfect, faultless, spotless Lamb of God, and if you have his blood, you have freedom. Jesus, the firstborn son, will be sacrificed so that the sons and daughters of God can find real freedom. And so what the Lamb offers you today is he offers bread and he offers blood. And all who will receive it will find eternal freedom. True liberation. And so what do we find in our story? We find Barabbas, the son of the father, the guilty one, the one who deserved to be executed. He walks free, while the perfect, innocent, blameless, firstborn son, he is sacrificed for his freedom. And so to finish, let me quote John the Baptist from chapter 1. Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. So dear friends, that's what we're going to do. We're going to behold the Lamb of God with bread and with blood, because he has taken away our sin and we are free forever in him. So at your own time, there's communion stuff around the room. Please, thank you. But let's keep our eyes on Jesus. I'd like you to go and take bread and wine, and I'd like you just to celebrate the freedom that Jesus brings us together. And then Mark's going to bring it to a close. Thank you.